Okay, so you're here because you really want to get a solid grasp on, like, the whole idea of revenge.
Yeah,
And specifically, you're interested in what Jenine Shelton has to say about it in her book, Sweet Revenge, right?
that's right.
You want to dive deep, figure out the definitions, the psychology behind it, the ethical side of things, the different ways it plays out in the real world. But you also want to do it without getting totally bogged down, you know? You
Yeah,
want the key takeaways without having to wade through a ton of detail.
absolutely.
So think of this deep dive as your express lane to really understanding revenge. We're going to hit the highlights, uncover some surprising facts, and make sure you walk away with a clear picture of what it's all about.
Exactly. We're using Shelton's book as our roadmap to explore, I guess you could say, the driving forces behind
Yeah.
that urge for revenge, how it pops up in our everyday lives, from those little personal conflicts to, bigger financial battles, even how different cultures approach this very human instinct. The goal is to leave you with an understanding that's not just clear and thorough, but maybe even a little bit eye-opening.
I like that. Eye-opening. So let's start with the basics then, shall we? What exactly is revenge? Like, at its core.
Right. Getting down to the nitty-gritty.
Yeah. Sheldon describes it as, like, this instinctive reaction to a perceived wrong. It's all about evening the score, bringing things back into balance.
Yeah.
And it often stems from this fundamental human need, like to feel worthy, respected. When someone does something that makes us feel like that's been taken away, bam, the urge for revenge can kick in.
What's super interesting is how Shelton breaks down the emotional brew that kind of simmers before that desire for revenge really takes hold.
Right.
We're talking about like a potent mix of anger, that feeling of betrayal, sometimes even a sense of powerlessness.
Oh, absolutely.
In those moments, the idea of revenge, it can start to feel like a lifeline, a way to grab back some control. And get this, our brains actually get a little hit of dopamine, that feel-good chemical, just from thinking about getting even.
Wow. So there's like a biological basis for this urge.
It seems that way. But Sheldon's quick to point out that this rush of satisfaction, it's usually temporary. It fades fast.
Oh, I see. Like that initial, gotcha feeling.
Exactly. And that's where things can get tricky, because it can easily morph into a tit-for-tat cycle, creating more problems than it solves.
Right. Because if you get that little hit of dopamine, you're almost chasing that feeling, right? It's like
It's like a sugar rush. Feels good for a minute, but it's not going to sustain you.
Exactly. So you get that temporary high, but then it can quickly spiral into a whole new mess.
Yeah, and that's where understanding the cultural context becomes crucial. Shelton emphasizes how the acceptance of revenge, like whether it's seen as okay or not, it varies wildly across cultures.
Right. Like in some societies, it's deeply embedded in their values and traditions.
Think about like historical feuds. Some cultures have these long-standing vendettas passed down through generations.
It's like their version of justice or something. Right?
In a way, yeah. But then Shelton contrasts this with cultures that put a huge emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation. For them, that's the way to heal and mend relationships after someone's been wronged.
So it's like two completely different approaches, two completely different social frameworks.
Exactly. And Shelton's point is that our cultural background plays a huge role in how we react in those moments when we feel like we've been dealt an injustice.
Right. It shapes our gut reaction.
Yeah. And as Shelton suggests, getting a handle on this cultural context, it gives you valuable insight into why some behaviors might be considered, totally okay in one part of the world and completely unacceptable in another.
Makes sense. It helps you decode those motivations that might seem totally foreign at first glance.
Precisely. So you start to see that revenge, it's not just about those big dramatic confrontations.
Yeah.
As Shelton lays out, it can take many different forms, from those subtle digs you might throw in a personal relationship all the way to more calculated actions like going after someone to recover a debt.
Right. So it's a whole spectrum.
It is. And I think what's important for you to walk away with here is this. By grasping the concept of revenge from all these different angles, you become more aware of your own feelings and impulses when you encounter some kind of injustice.
Right.
It gives you that power to make a choice about how you're going to respond. Instead of just reacting instinctively, you can pause and decide your next move.
I like that. Choice over reaction. Okay, so we've talked about what revenge is, the forms it takes, and how cultural background plays into it.
Yeah.
Now let's get into the why. What's the psychology behind that burning desire to get payback?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
It is. And Shelton argues that at its root, this urge for revenge stems from this deeply ingrained sense of fairness. It's about the need for balance and equilibrium in our relationships with other people.
Yeah, it's about how we interact with the world, how we expect to be treated, and how we expect others to behave.
Right. And when we feel like that balance has been disrupted, when someone does something we perceive as unfair or unjust, that's when things can get, well, messy.
Absolutely. There's this sense that that the scales of justice have tipped, and we feel this almost primal need to rebalance them.
Exactly. Like that need for equilibrium you mentioned.
And this isn't just some abstract philosophical concept. When we experience a perceived injustice, our brains go haywire.
Really?
Yep. As we've touched on, that anticipation of retribution, it actually triggers our brain's reward system.
Wow.
We get a little hit of dopamine signaling that sweet, sweet feeling of restoring that lost equilibrium. And think about it from an evolutionary standpoint. A successful act of revenge back in the day might have literally meant the difference between, surviving another day or not.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's almost like a survival mechanism wired into us.
In a way, yeah. And Shelton really digs into this idea of fairness, this innate sense that we develop super early on in childhood.
Oh, yeah. Kids are all about what's fair and what's not.
Exactly. And when that internal sense of justice gets violated, that's when that powerful drive to restore balance kicks into high gear.
Right. Like that urge to right the wrong, even if it means doing something potentially questionable in return.
Yeah. And it's not just about satisfying some individual need for vengeance. It's also about upholding those social norms that we kind of all agree to live by.
Right, like the rules of engagement in society.
Exactly. And Sheldon argues that this fundamental need for fairness, this desire to send the clear signal that certain actions won't be tolerated, it often dictates the way people actually go about seeking revenge. It's almost like they're trying to rewrite the rules of the game in a way that feels right to them.
So they're basically saying, hey, there are consequences for your actions.
Exactly. But Shelton also cautions that the psychological fallout from seeking revenge, it's not always pretty. It can be incredibly complex and often leads to some unexpected outcomes.
Right. Like even if you get that initial feeling of, I showed them, it can quickly turn into something less satisfying.
Yeah. You might experience a burst of empowerment at first, but it can easily spiral into feelings of guilt, and it can spark even more conflict, creating this endless cycle of retaliation.
It's like a boomerang. You throw it out there and it just keeps coming back and hitting you in the face.
That's a perfect analogy. And it makes navigating those desires for revenge incredibly difficult, right? Because you're trying to balance those feelings with your own emotional well-being and the need to heal, to move on.
Yeah, you don't want to get stuck in that cycle.
Precisely. And Shelton's point here is that understanding the potential emotional cost of revenge can encourage you to pause and consider other approaches that prioritize growth and resolution.
Right, finding a healthier way to move forward.
Exactly. And remember, we talked about the role of culture earlier. Well, as Sheldon points out, culture has a huge influence on how we even interpret this whole idea of payback.
Right, so some cultures are more accepting of it than others.
Yeah, exactly. As we've touched on, some cultures put honor and retribution on a pedestal, while others are all about forgiveness and moving on. And Shelton argues that applying this cultural lens is essential to understanding why certain people, or even entire groups, might be more likely to seek revenge in certain situations.
It's like a cultural code that dictates what's an appropriate response and what's not.
Exactly. And it highlights that context really is everything when we're trying to make sense of this very complicated human behavior.
So it's not just black and white, right or wrong.
Not at all. And Shelton goes on to explore how the digital age has thrown a whole new wrench into the works.
Oh yeah, the internet, everything's different online.
It is. Online interactions, the vulnerabilities of cybersecurity, the dynamics of social media, it's a whole different playing field for potential payback.
Right, because you have anonymity. You have this potential for things to go viral.
Exactly. And Shelton points out how this anonymity, combined with the sheer speed and reach of information online, it can fuel those feelings of anger and that urge for retribution.
Oh yeah, it's like throwing gasoline on a fire.
It is. And then you have the potential for public shaming on a massive scale, something that was unimaginable before the internet.
It's a whole new level of exposure and potential damage.
It is. So Sheldon suggests that as we navigate this increasingly digital world, it's even more crucial to think carefully about our motivations.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are we really trying to achieve when we seek payback online? And what are the long-term consequences, both for ourselves and the people we're targeting?
Because those consequences can be pretty far-reaching, right?
Absolutely. And Shelton argues that by really grappling with the psychology behind revenge, by understanding those emotional responses and the societal forces that shape them, we can start to develop a more thoughtful approach to dealing with conflict, both in the real world and online.
Okay, I'm ready to get into the ethical side of things now. This always feels like a bit of a minefield.
It is, yeah. Shelton presents the ethics of revenge as a very knotty, very controversial area. It's rarely clear-cut.
Right, because it's not like there's a universal rule book that says, thou shalt not seek revenge.
Exactly. And as Shelton points out, the morality of revenge often hinges on the underlying intention.
Okay, so like, why are you really seeking revenge?
Right. Is it fueled purely by anger and the desire to inflict pain? Or is there, a genuine yearning for justice or a need for closure? That distinction, according to Shelton, is crucial in how we evaluate the ethical implications of an act of revenge.
So it's not just about the act itself, but the motivation behind it?
Exactly. But even when those intentions seem, justifiable, Shelton warns that revenge often has these unforeseen negative consequences.
Right, because you might think you're righting a wrong, but you could actually be creating a bigger mess.
Exactly. You might be setting off a chain of events that leads to even more suffering, not just for the person you're targeting, but for everyone involved.
Like a ripple effect. Right?
Exactly. And if we look specifically at personal relationships, Shelton emphasizes how revenge can completely rewrite the dynamics of a relationship.
Right.
It can decimate trust, slam the door on open communication and intimacy.
And once that trust is broken, it can be so hard to get it back.
It can be. And Shelton forces us to ask ourselves this tough question. Does seeking revenge actually help us heal and grow as individuals? Or are we just, perpetuating a cycle of pain, both for ourselves and the people we care about?
Right, because revenge doesn't always lead to that catharsis we might be hoping for.
It doesn't. And when we move into areas like financial payback and workplace retribution, as Shelton does, the ethical lines become even more blurred.
Yeah, because in those situations, there's often this complex mix of personal feelings, professional obligations, and, legal considerations.
Exactly. So in cases of debt recovery or those nasty office disputes, Shelton argues that the desire for revenge might be understandable, but going about it the wrong way, using questionable tactics, can be incredibly damaging.
Right, because it can erode those ethical boundaries and lead to legal trouble, damage your reputation.
Yeah, exactly. And in these contexts, Shelton really advocates for sticking to those well-established legal and negotiation strategies. She suggests that these approaches are, generally more ethical, and they're more likely to lead to a resolution that doesn't leave everyone worse off.
Okay, so a more structured, less emotionally driven approach.
Exactly. And once again, Shelton brings up that crucial point about the role of culture in shaping our ethical compass.
Right, because what's considered acceptable in one culture might be completely off limits in another.
Precisely. So when it comes to revenge, what's considered ethical, both in terms of whether it's even okay to seek it and how you go about it, it varies dramatically across cultures.
So there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to the ethics of revenge.
There isn't. And that's why Shelton concludes that that navigating this complex area demands a real deep dive into your personal values, a thorough understanding of the potential consequences of your actions, and an appreciation for the broader impact it can have on your relationships and even society as a whole.
So it's about taking that step back and saying, okay, what are my values? What are the potential repercussions here? And am I contributing to something positive? Or just fueling the fire?
Exactly. And ultimately, Shelton encourages us to consciously choose a path that leads to healing and growth rather than simply reacting from a place of anger or hurt.
Right, taking that high road even when it's tough.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it's in those moments of conscious choice that we can start to find more fulfilling and healthier ways to address those inevitable feelings of injustice.
Okay, I like that. So we've talked about what revenge is, the psychology behind it, the ethical considerations, and let's get practical. How do people actually go about getting payback?
Right, let's dive into the how-to.
Exactly. And Shelton offers this really interesting framework for understanding different approaches to revenge. She categorizes it into two main types. Emotional and practical.
It's a helpful distinction.
It is. So emotional revenge, as Shelton describes it, is all about that gut reaction, those raw emotions.
Yeah, like lashing out.
Exactly. It's often fueled by anger, hurt, the need to strike back quickly and make the other person feel the same pain you're feeling. And this tends to play out a lot in personal relationships, like with friends, family, romantic partners.
Yeah, that makes sense, because those are the relationships where emotions run highest.
Right. And while emotional revenge might offer that temporary feeling of satisfaction, Shelton points out that it can lead to some serious escalation.
Yeah, because it's often impulsive, and it doesn't leave much room for, like, stepping back and considering the bigger picture.
Right. You're just reacting in the heat of the moment.
Exactly. And that's where things can spiral out of control pretty quickly. Now, contrast that with what Shelton calls practical revenge.
Okay, so this is less about pure emotion and more about strategy.
Exactly. It's about taking a step back, thinking things through, and having a specific goal in mind.
So it's more calculated.
It is, and it often involves a plan of action, a series of steps aimed at restoring that sense of balance or achieving a particular outcome.
Okay, so give me some examples.
Well, it could be something like systematically working to recover a debt that someone owes you.
Right.
Or maybe it's about addressing a serious issue in the workplace in a way that leads to a tangible change.
So it's about taking action to right a wrong, but doing it in a way that's less about emotional outburst and more about achieving a specific result.
Exactly. And Sheldon suggests that this distinction between emotional and practical revenge, it's particularly useful in personal relationships.
Okay, so how so?
Well, when you're dealing with conflict in a close relationship, recognizing whether your impulse is coming from a place of pure emotion or a desire for a more practical resolution, it can help you figure out a clearer path forward.
Right, it's like choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And sometimes that might mean simply having an honest conversation with the person and trying to work things out directly rather than resorting to, those emotionally charged actions.
That makes sense. So communication can be a form of practical revenge.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if it helps to establish boundaries and clarify expectations.
Okay. Now, let's talk about financial payback. What specific techniques does Shelton recommend for recovering a debt?
When it comes to getting your money back, Shelton really stresses the importance of understanding the nature of the debt itself.
Okay, so like what kind of debt are we talking about?
Exactly. She breaks it down into two main categories: unsecured debt and secured debt.
Okay, explain this to me.
So unsecured debt, that's things like credit card balances, personal loans that aren't backed by, any specific collateral.
Right.
These are often the types of debts that cause a lot of stress and conflict in personal relationships, especially when there's a sense of betrayal involved.
Oh, yeah, totally. Because it's not just about the money, it's about the broken trust.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's where that emotional element can really amplify the desire for revenge.
Right.
Now, secured debt, that's a different beast altogether. This is debt like mortgages, car loans,
Yes.
things that are tied to specific assets.
Okay, so there's more at stake.
There is. And when there's a breakdown of trust in a relationship, the potential for losing those assets, it adds a whole new layer of complexity to the whole idea of revenge.
It's not just about getting your money back anymore. It's about potentially losing your home or your car.
Exactly. And it often means navigating a whole web of legal issues and potential repercussions.
Makes sense. Sheldon also talks about workplace debt, right?
She does, yeah.
Yeah.
This is when you're dealing with things like unpaid wages, unreimbursed expenses, situations that can easily lead to tension and conflict between employers and employees.
Oh, for sure.
And Shelton emphasizes the importance of knowing your rights in these situations. Understanding the laws and procedures that protect workers is essential.
Right, because it's not always as clear-cut as it should be.
It isn't.
Yeah.
And as more and more of our financial transactions move online, there's also this whole new category of digital debt.
Oh, yeah, like online scams and stuff.
Yeah. And Shelton argues that even in those situations, it's crucial to carefully consider the potential consequences before pursuing any kind of digital payback.
Right, because it's easy to think that what happens online stays online.
It is. But the reality is that actions taken in the digital realm can have very real-world implications.
Absolutely. So we need to be just as mindful, just as strategic online as we are offline.
Precisely. Now, when it comes to the actual legal avenues for recovering a debt, Shelton outlines a few key strategies.
Okay, lay them on me.
So if you're dealing with a smaller amount of money, She suggests that small claims court can be a relatively straightforward option.
And you don't necessarily need a lawyer, right?
In many cases, no. But it's still important to be well prepared and have strong evidence to support your claim.
Right, you can't just waltz in there without any documentation.
No, you need to be organized. Now, for larger debts, or if the situation's more complex, Shelton suggests exploring the possibility of filing a formal lawsuit in civil court.
And that's when you definitely want to lawyer up.
Yeah, it can get pretty complicated, and you want to make sure you're doing everything by the book.
Right. What about if you want to avoid going to court altogether? Are there other options?
There are. Shelton also talks about using debt collection agencies, which are basically companies that specialize in getting people to pay up.
Right, they're the professionals.
They are. But it's important to choose a reputable agency, one that operates ethically and legally.
Yeah, you don't want to hire someone who's going to use shady tactics.
Exactly. And another option Shelton mentions is alternative dispute resolution, or ADR for short.
What's that?
It's basically a way to resolve disputes outside of the traditional court system.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it often involves things like mediation or arbitration, where a neutral third party helps facilitate communication and guide the parties towards a mutually agreeable solution.
Okay, so it's more about finding a compromise.
It is, and it
Right.
can often be faster and less expensive than going to court.
Makes sense. Now, what about actually negotiating with someone to get your money back? What tips does Shelton offer?
Shelton stresses that the key to successful negotiation is, again, preparation. Gather all your documentation, contracts, receipts, emails, anything that supports your claim.
Right, be organized.
Exactly. And when you're actually talking to the person, it's important to be clear, be confident, and stick to the facts. Avoid getting emotional,
Right, don't let your emotions derail the conversation.
Exactly. And it's helpful to propose a clear timeline for repayment.
Like, here's what I'm owed, and here's how I propose we handle it.
Precisely. And Shelton suggests that offering a compromise, like a structured payment plan, can sometimes be a really effective way to get the ball rolling.
Right, meet them halfway.
Yeah. And try to understand where they're coming from. What are their motivations? What are their constraints?
So put yourself in their shoes a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if, despite your best efforts, you just can't reach an agreement, then it might be time to consider escalating things.
Like taking legal action.
It could be, yeah. But it's important to carefully weigh the costs and benefits before you go down that road.
Right, because legal battles can be expensive and time-consuming.
It can be.
Yeah.
The goal is to find the most effective path to get your money back while minimizing further stress and disruption.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about something that can be a bit trickier to navigate. Workplace retribution.
Yeah, the office can be a minefield.
It can. So how does Shelton advise us to handle those conflicts and grievances that inevitably pop up in a professional setting?
Well, first and foremost, she stresses the importance of being able to accurately identify and understand workplace grievances.
So knowing when something is truly a problem that needs to be addressed.
Exactly. And this involves being attuned to, the whole atmosphere of the workplace. You need to be able to spot those telltale signs that something's amiss.
Okay, like what?
Well, it could be a noticeable dip in morale, or maybe people are calling in sick more often.
Right.
Or you might notice changes in how people are communicating, less collaboration, more tension.
So it's about paying attention to those subtle shifts in the dynamics.
It is. And Shelton also emphasizes the importance of fostering open communication in the workplace.
Right, because if people feel like they can't speak up, problems are just going to fester.
Exactly. So creating those safe spaces for employees to voice their concerns, that's crucial. It could be through regular feedback sessions, anonymous surveys, having an open door policy.
So it's about making it clear that you're open to hearing about problems and addressing them.
Exactly. And it's also vital for employees to understand their rights. Knowing the laws, the policies, the procedures that protect them, that gives them a sense of empowerment.
Right, because if you don't know your rights, you're more likely to just put up with things you shouldn't.
Exactly. And Shelton also highlights the importance of self-reflection.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, before you go charging off on some revenge mission in the workplace, it's crucial to take a step back and examine your own motivations.
Right, check yourself.
Yeah, because sometimes those feelings of being wronged, they might be colored by personal biases or, other stuff that's going on in your life.
So it's about making sure that you're not misinterpreting the situation.
Exactly. You want to be as objective as possible. And finally, Shelton reminds us that the workplace is a melting pot of different cultures.
Right, so everyone brings their own perspectives and experiences to the table.
Exactly. And that means that what one person perceives as a major grievance might be seen as, just a minor annoyance by someone else.
So cultural sensitivity is key.
It is. Being aware of those different cultural norms around communication and conflict, it can help to prevent misunderstandings from escalating into, full-blown battles.
Makes sense. Now, what about actually seeking some form of payback in the workplace? What strategies does Shelton suggest?
Well, Shelton's a big advocate for thinking strategically and always keeping the big picture in mind.
So don't let your emotions cloud your judgment.
Exactly. And when it comes to specific strategies, she highlights the power of communication.
Okay, so like actually talking to the person you have a problem with?
It could be, yeah. If it's appropriate, having that direct conversation, being assertive about your needs and expectations, that can be a really effective way to address the issue head on.
Right. Sometimes a good conversation can clear the air.
It can. And Shelton also suggests documenting everything, keeping a record of incidents and reporting them to HR or, whoever's in charge.
So having that paper trail?
Exactly. Because if things do escalate, you'll be glad you have that documentation.
That makes sense. What about if you want to take things into your own hands a little bit? Like, are there more proactive strategies?
Shelton does suggest the possibility of, making a strategic shift in your own work approach.
Okay, how so?
Well, it could be something like really focusing on your own performance, exceeding expectations.
Right, like showing them what they're missing.
Yeah. Or maybe it's about actively seeking out new opportunities for growth and development within the company, making yourself more valuable.
So it's like focusing on your own success as a form of, I guess you could say, silent payback?
Exactly. And it could even mean, looking for a better position elsewhere. Sometimes the best revenge is simply moving on to something better.
I like that. Now, I have to ask, does Shelton ever endorse those more creative, less conventional forms of workplace payback?
She does touch on it, but very cautiously. She acknowledges that in some workplace cultures, a well-placed prank or a witty comeback can be a way to, to make a point.
Right, but it's all about context, right?
It is. You have to be extremely careful. What might be seen as funny and harmless in one workplace could be totally inappropriate in another.
Yeah, you don't want to get fired for a bad joke.
Exactly. And Shelton really emphasizes the importance of cultural awareness. You have to understand the nuances of the workplace environment and make sure that whatever you're doing, it doesn't cross the line into harassment or unprofessional behavior.
Right, because the potential consequences could be pretty serious.
They could be. Now, it's also crucial to be aware of the potential downsides of seeking revenge in the workplace, even if you think it's justified.
Okay, like what?
Well, one of the biggest risks is damage to your reputation. Workplace gossip spreads fast, and once you get a reputation as someone who's, vindictive or difficult to work with, it can be really hard to shake.
Right, it can follow you around.
It can. And then there's the fact that revenge often breeds more conflict.
So instead of resolving the issue, you're actually making it worse.
Exactly. It can create this toxic atmosphere that makes it unpleasant for everyone.
And that can ultimately hurt productivity, right?
It can, yeah. And we've talked about the legal risks before, but it's worth reiterating here. If your actions are perceived as harassment, discrimination, or retaliation, you could find yourself in some serious legal hot water.
Right. So you could be the one getting sued.
Exactly. And beyond those tangible consequences, there's also the toll it takes on your mental and emotional well-being.
Oh, for sure. Revenge can be stressful.
It can be. All that plotting and scheming, it can take up a lot of mental energy, create anxiety.
Yeah, it could distract you from, actually doing your job and focusing on your career.
Precisely. So Shelton argues that in many cases, the costs of seeking revenge in the workplace far outweigh the potential benefits.
Okay, that's a good point to keep in mind. Now, let's shift gears and talk about legal payback, specifically lawsuits. What's the legal framework around revenge, and how does it vary depending on the situation?
Well, as you can imagine, the legal landscape around revenge is pretty complex.
I bet.
Yeah. And as Shelton points out, it varies wildly depending on, where you are in the world, the specific nature of the Revenge Act, and a whole bunch of other factors.
So there's no universal revenge law?
Not at all. The consequences can range from, something as seemingly minor as a civil lawsuit seeking monetary damages, all the way to criminal charges, depending on the severity of the act.
Okay, so the stakes can be pretty high.
They can be. And Shelton provides a bunch of examples of how seeking revenge in different areas of life can land you in legal trouble.
Like what?
Well, in personal relationships, for example, if those acts of revenge escalate into harassment, stalking, or defamation, you're crossing a legal line.
Right, so there's a limit to what you can get away with, even if you feel justified.
Absolutely. And when it comes to financial payback, while recovering a debt might be perfectly legal, you have to do it the right way.
So no breaking kneecaps?
Definitely not. Employing illegal or unethical collection practices, that's a recipe for legal trouble. And in the workplace, if your attempts at retribution are seen as retaliation for, say, whistleblowing or reporting discrimination, you could be in big trouble.
Right, because those are protected activities.
Exactly. And then there's the whole digital realm. Things like doxing, hacking, those are serious cybercrimes, even if they're motivated by revenge.
Okay, so the bottom line is, if you're thinking about seeking legal payback, you need to be very careful and understand.